Well, thank you all for coming out. This is really exciting, and as I'm learning more and more about what you're doing here in St. Louis, kudos. The only one thing I might say is Kansas City's a little bit ahead of you, so let's get some competition going across the state, and everybody will be the better for it. So, yes, I'm Patsy Carter. I have worked for the Department of Mental Health for 25 years. Laurent, 25 years. I feel old. I am old. And just last year, we kind of started something new where I now have a joint appointment, so to speak, using university language, with Children's Division, our child welfare agency for the state, because they want to become a trauma-informed system, an entire system. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means about being trauma-informed, because what we have found, you know, when something becomes really popular, everybody jumps on the bandwagon real quick, and they don't even know where it's going or what it means or how to get off or anything. So we're going to talk some about kind of this continuum we've developed in the state of Missouri that we hope to be releasing very soon. And actually, some folks at the national level are chomping at the bit for us to release this, because it has been really helpful in kind of shaping what we're doing here in Missouri, both in ensuring that when people say they're trauma-informed, we all know what that means. Plus, it kind of is a nice way to go along that journey. I tell this story because they tell it on themselves. For several years, I had gone to Children's Division and said, don't you want to become a trauma-informed organization, right? And it kept going back and back. And they said, yeah, but gosh, we've got so much to do. Sorry, I've got my stuff spread out all over. We've got so many things that we need to do. And they were going through the accreditation process. And when I would talk about what being trauma-informed meant, it just seemed so overwhelming to them. And it can appear very overwhelming, although actually the biggest secret is it's not that difficult once you get it. Once you understand what you're really doing, it's not so difficult. But when we broke it down to them for this continuum, that you start becoming trauma aware, which is what we're about today, then you move on to being trauma sensitive, and then trauma responsive, which is what that training is next month. And then kind of the gold standard that we're talking about in the Missouri model is becoming a trauma-informed organization, okay? That's the gold standard. That's a culture shift. So when the question was asked, what would it look like to live or be in a trauma-informed community, right? That means everything is changing. The policies, the laws, how we interact with each other, our practices, our environments. And it's not just mental health or physical health. It is schools, it's dental appointments, or dentist offices, it's libraries, it's churches, it's every single part of that community can become at least trauma-sensitive and responsive, if not fully trauma-informed. And again, hopefully as you join us on this journey, you'll get to see the differences at each stage along the continuum. So although I work predominantly in the children's field, our trauma initiative with the state, for which I'm the lead for the Department of Mental Health, is a lifespan initiative. So this is not unique to children. We will be talking today about the impact of what you may have heard as adverse childhood experiences, the ACE study. But that doesn't mean this only applies to children, okay? And we'll get into some of that. But I want to go on record early on, this is a lifespan issue. And just like was said before, it's not just a mental health or a physical health issue. This goes across all components of a community. The last thing I want to say before I get into the meat of the PowerPoint is you will see throughout the PowerPoint some art that was done, and even here the artwork is from the Anna Institute. The Anna Institute is a great resource. There's many, many resources, and it's just growing about trauma. Anna, I would like to say, was a trauma of survivor. Unfortunately, she was not. She ended up taking her life. And her mother, since then, this has been many, many, many years ago, has dedicated her life to addressing trauma, because at that point, trauma was not really recognized in the mental health field. And she, unfortunately, her daughter, Anna, spent time in what we used to call the back wards. And Laurent, you remember those? I worked on them when I first started with the Department of Mental Health. And nobody was really seeing. She got lots of labels, you know, all the different diagnoses, lots of medications, lots of different treatment, and nothing was really making a difference, and she ultimately took her life. But Anna was also a great artist, and so the artwork you see is Anna's art. that her mother has available on the website for Anna Institute, along with other information, and she really appreciates people using Anna's art in memory of Anna. So I do want to point that out to folks, that I use her artwork in almost everything that I do to honor Anna's work. I really prefer discussion as opposed to me just standing up here. This is kind of a didactic presentation, but if at any point you have a question, please ask it, because this is really about you guys getting what you need out of it rather than me getting through a PowerPoint, right? Now, if we get too far off task, I might say, can we talk afterwards so that we don't take up everybody's time? But I do want you to be able to ask your questions when it arises, because if you're wondering it, a lot of other people may be asking the same question in their head, and you're the brave one who raised your hand, okay? So to start off, we need to talk about a definition of trauma. And probably folks have, read in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual about post-traumatic stress disorder, and in there is a definition of trauma. And basically, it's an event where someone is personally feeling threatened, their safety. It may be that they're also witnessing somebody else who they love, whose safety is being threatened. But at the national level, we've kind of broken it down into a different type of definition to make it a very personal definition, because what's a trauma for me may not be a trauma for you, right? Or you. And what's traumatic for you may not be traumatic to these ladies and gentlemen, okay? So we have to add a real personal focus to this about trauma. Can you guys see? Okay, all right. So first off, we have the 3 E's, so it's an easy way for you to remember this. The first one is the actual event, something that happened that could potentially cause harm to somebody else, or somebody that witnessed something that could have actually harmed somebody else. So it's an extreme threat of physical or psychological harm, or the withholding of material or relational resources. And we're going to talk a lot. Relationships is an extremely important issue in trauma, because a lot of times what is the traumatizing event, so to speak, is something that occurred within a relationship. So we talk about the way to heal trauma is through relationships. All right, so you'll hear us talk a lot about relationships. So it can be a single event or a repeated event, and we'll talk about different types of events, and also when it's just something that happens once, or if it happens over a period of time. The second part of the definition of trauma is the actual experience, how that person assigns a meaning to that event. Everybody has their own different perceptions. And I'm sure you have heard in the eyewitness field for law enforcement, you can have 2 people who were standing side by side and saw the same thing, and their stories are going to be different, right? Because they bring something to it from their own personal experience. And that's where we say that nobody else can judge what is actually traumatic except for the person who experienced it. So you can't say, oh, that wasn't traumatic. I've had that happen to me. It wasn't traumatic for me. It doesn't matter, because they come at this with different history, different perceptions, and so their experience of that event is unique and different. All right? And finally, we talk about the effects. That is what that person then experiences following what may have been a traumatic event for them. So, and this can be in a lot of different areas. It can be neurological, it can be physical, it can be emotional. We have lots of different symptoms of trauma. And again, a lot of it depends how that person has been raised, the experiences that they've had, their perception of the environment, the level of support that they have in their own environment and through their relationships. So those are the 3 E's: event, experience, and effects. Does that make sense? Okay. Nice, easy way to remember it. So basically, though, trauma occurs when our coping mechanisms are overwhelmed, right? We all have a certain level of stress in our life, and it comes and goes, ups and downs, ebbs and flows. But when we talk about when it becomes traumatic or a toxic stress, it's because we are overwhelmed on an ongoing basis for a certain level. And what we need to talk about is that we know that this level of trauma, this toxic stress, can have adverse effects on our well-being, our physical health, our mental health, our relationships, okay? A lot of folks just think about trauma in terms of the mental health symptoms that may occur from this. But as was noted, it has a strong tie, and we're going to talk about, to physical health. It has a strong tie to our ability to parent. It has a strong tie to our ability to be effective employees, okay? So that's one thing that we really need to remember, that it's not just the extreme case of when it's impacting somebody and they're developing some type of mental health issues or physical health issues. It, again, falls on a continuum, right? So that we may have days when we're at work where we feel like we're there 100%. Other days we may feel, oh, we're just barely at 50% and getting by. And depending upon our level of stress, how well we are making decisions. How many of you have heard of Dr. Bruce Perry? Anybody? Okay, good. He's a leading researcher and clinician, which is a great combination to have, in children's mental health. And he talks about that we should never make decisions at work because our decisions at work are awful, that they're bad, okay? Because how many of you have a stressful job? Really? You guys? Well, okay. I was going to say, I didn't see any hand go up. I was going to say, wow, where do you guys work? I want to come work there. I mean, that you have this stuff just flying at you all the time, and that we try to make decisions in that type of environment. When do you make your best decisions? I used to joke, and this was even before I learned about trauma, that I had my best ideas about like a big systems project or something like that when I was on my way for my annual fishing trip, because it's a long drive. I have a lot of windshield time. I'm listening to music. I don't have anybody yakking at me. The phone's not ringing. I don't have to do email and all of that. And I have these great aha moments in the car when I'm totally relaxed. Whereas at work, I probably could never get that type of time. So his joke is you shouldn't make decisions at work. Now, I don't think we could live that way or work that way, but it's something to think about if you're really struggling with something. Shut it down, go home, sit on your deck, go fishing, whatever it takes for you to be able to at your full capacity and not impacted by stress. The other piece that we know about trauma that is that it's very prevalent. It's not just some disenfranchised group over here that has experienced the trauma or the stress. In the general population, 50% of people have experienced at least one traumatic event in their lifetime. 25% have experienced 2 or more traumatic stresses in their lifetime. When you get up to about 4 stressors, that's when we're talking about chronic stress. And that's about 1 out of 16 people have experienced that level of chronic stress. And then when you get up to 6 or more stressors, that's about 1 out of 22, or about a little less than 5% of the population. 5% of the population, though, has experienced high levels of toxic stress. Okay? And again, you'll see that it kind of falls on a continuum from if you have one traumatic event happen, your increase in probability of having some type of negative impact either on your physical health, using drugs, mental health, problems with employment, whatever that may be. As the number of stressors goes up, your probability of having those problems also goes up. Okay? So we have 5% of the population that is going to have significant problems. And unfortunately, right now, we're still not identifying the etiology of those problems as the trauma. We're still dealing with this medical model approach in treating physical and mental health issues and not recognizing really those social stimuli, that history of chronic stress that is leading to these problems. So we know what trauma is, that it can impact many areas of our functioning, and that it's very prevalent in the general population. Okay? So let's talk about kind of different types of trauma, because they can have potentially different impacts. All right? Now, first off, you need to know that the research on trauma is still growing. It has been around for about 20 years, but it is still growing in what we know. So what we learn today, next year we come back and hopefully it's more refined and we know even more about that. All right? So what we're going to talk about here is 2 different types of trauma that I'm going to call private trauma versus public trauma. Private trauma is typically what happens, the sexual abuse, the physical abuse, domestic violence, those things that are often kept a secret, right? Often because the perpetrator is threatening or cajoling the victim. You know, if you tell anybody this happens, your mom's going to go to jail. If you do this, I'm going to take your kids and leave you. All those different kind of threats that can happen. So what does that individual do? That victim has to keep it to themselves, right? What do you do when you have a problem or feeling really upset, right? Often don't you share that with somebody else? Here, you've got a potentially very traumatizing event that they really can't share with anybody else, okay? So you have that secretive nature to it. There is typically also this power imbalance, all right? And this is really important because that view on power stays with the individual, and even as an adult, I mean, through their childhood and into their adulthood, their view of authority figures is very different because of what happened with that power imbalance. You cannot trust authority figures. And believe you me, every single one of you in this room is an authority figure. You may not think it, you may not feel that way at work, but when you're dealing with the individuals in the work that you do, you're viewed as an authority figure. Okay, so you'll have to remember that when we get down the road and we start talking about being trauma sensitive and trauma responsive, how we have to change our interactions and recognize that we are viewed in that sense as an authority figure. Okay, because there is that power imbalance, whether it's a physical threat, one's bigger, an age issue of a power imbalance, a parent over a child, perhaps it's a teacher, a minister, a neighbor, an adult neighbor. The power imbalance may be financial, right? You get that a lot in some types of domestic violence situations where the woman cannot afford to leave because she is financially dependent on the abuser, right? So you have that power imbalance in these private events. Often the victims talk about having this raging sense of hopelessness, all right? You can't talk to anybody about it. The perpetrator has much more power than you do. Can you see where that could pretty easily make you feel kind of hopeless? I can't change this. I can't ask anybody to help me because I'm afraid of what might happen. They have so much authority, I'm dependent upon them. So that they feel, that leads often to these feelings of depression, etc., that they can't find a way out of this situation. They also talk about, and again, because of that sense of secrecy and power imbalance, a sense of isolation. We've all often talked about the power of like support groups when people find out, you mean I'm not the only one who's experienced this? That there are other people who are having these same feelings that I do, that it's not me being crazy, that everybody, or a lot of other folks are experiencing the same thing. So that sense of isolation, again, cuts them off from a lot of very powerful healing relationships. All right? Then they'll often talk about, survivors will often talk about having this irretrievable sense of loss. They may not be able to fully define it, and two people may have kind of this different sense of loss. All right? It may be a loss of their innocence, of their childhood, of their sense of safety. And one of the things that we know about trauma is safety is a critical area of focus. And the individual, the victim, is constantly concerned about safety. And I'm not just talking about physical, I'm talking about emotional, psychological safety as well. And our interventions have to always occur in a safe environment. And only the victims can really tell us what makes it feel safe. And that's why we get a lot of kids and adults who are in psychiatric hospitals, jails, detention centers, whatever, that are acting out in a way that nobody can explain. It seems highly unpredictable. There was no precipitating event in the environment. That's because that individual was scanning and something made them feel unsafe. Okay? And that's usually when you see that quick, high, unpredictable escalation in their behavior. So safety is a key factor that we will talk about when we talk about trauma. But it's also funny that what people may define as their major loss. For example, a lot of folks from refugees who have lived in war-torn areas and then gone on to refugee camps, they find the camps much more stressful or trauma-producing than the violence that they lived in their home. Okay? One woman who survived, this violence in a refugee camp said that her biggest loss, her biggest sense of irretrievable loss, was her inability to get an education. That was the thing that hurt her the most. In the trauma responsive training I do, I show a part of a video, and some of you may have seen this, called Healing Need. Has anybody heard of that? So now you have to come to the March 31st presentation. But Healing Need is very good. And actually, Toni Arcane is a speaker. She's been here a couple of times in Missouri. She was just at the Domestic Violence Conference last year. Wonderful, wonderful speaker. But she has a horrendous history of trauma. And she shared when she was here last that with everything she went through, the physical abuse, the sexual abuse, the drug abuse, she was abused while she was in jail. She was sexually assaulted by the guards while she was in jail. I mean, her history is just, you have to admire her for being able to get up every morning and face the day after what she's gone through, is the loss of her children. That is her biggest trauma that she still struggles with, and you can see it in her when she talks about it. That is her irretrievable loss, was the loss of her children to the system and not being able to get them back. Okay, so it may be defined very differently, but there is that sense of irretrievable loss. Then the other thing that we know, and this is what's really fascinating and is growing more and more, and Dr. Bruce Perry is doing a lot of work in this area, he's a neuroscientist, that we have this reaction. It's an evolutionary reaction. It's made us survive as a species, and you see it a lot in other species in animal kingdom. This response of fight, flight, or freeze. Okay? Our brain, and we'll get into some of the brain development part of this, but our brain matures from the back kind of towards the front, with the brainstem being pretty fully developed when we're born, and then as we gain more and more experience, it starts developing other parts of our brain. Our fight, flight, or freeze response is in the bottom part of our brain, and basically in our brainstem, goes up into our limbic system, our emotional part of our brain. But it's a very primitive part of the brain, and it kicks in when we're not feeling safe. So if you have an individual who's becoming very dysregulated, say on a residential unit or a psychiatric hospital or a detention center, what are we often doing at those times when that person is becoming very dysregulated? We're trying to talk them down. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Usually I think the professionals are going to escalate the situation.
We do. Yeah, we do. And with the best of intentions. I'm not saying anything in criticizing anybody, but we think, let's talk to them. Let's calm them down, right? And so we start talking to them, and it's not typically working. That's because talking takes part in the higher parts of our brain. When we're not feeling safe, that part of our brain shuts down, literally, and all of our energy and resources goes to our more primitive part of our brain. That's not going to be responsive to this talking and this cognitive approach. And we'll talk some about the cognitive interventions that have been developed in response to trauma. They're very good. Many of them are evidence-based, and they have a place. But we also have huge gaps because many of the trauma survivors are not ready for cognitive interventions because they're still functioning in this lower part of their brain, and they cannot benefit and respond to it. Okay? So our fight, flight, or freeze, we're in the woods, and here's a bear, right? So our body is going to go through this whole physiological response, and we have to make a quick decision. All of this is happening very quickly and not necessarily in our awareness. Okay, can I outrun that bear? Okay, yeah, you shouldn't be trying. Can I get into a fight with the bear, and can I win? Ooh, I don't know about that one either, right? Maybe I can just freeze, and the bear won't notice me, right? So those are three responses. They're evolutionary responses built into our system to keep us safe, not only as an individual, but as a species, okay? This is what you're often seeing when people are triggered through their trauma history. And you will see they're either going to fight, flight, or freeze. They're literally going to try to run away, avoid it. They're going to try to fight it, right? And we've all seen that, the high levels of aggression. Or they may do that freeze, which often takes the form of disassociation. Okay? And it's not something that we've really paid a whole lot of attention to around disassociation, particularly if it's a mild dissociation. We may think they're just not paying attention or they're daydreaming, but it's actually a form of mild disassociation. With that freeze also, you just get a lot of very lethargic, don't feel like you have any motivation, not responding to anything. So we have seen these reactions time and time again in the work that we're doing. Does that make sense? Does that feel right to what you're seeing and experiencing? Okay. So the other type of trauma that we talk about are public events. So these can be natural disasters, car accidents, medical procedures, war, any type of violence, etc. And often these are a shared experience. Okay? So if you've been assaulted in the parking lot, you're probably not keeping that to yourself. Of course, unless you're my mother. She tends to keep it to herself because she thinks we're going to worry about her. But you share it. You get your support, right? So whether it was, getting mugged in the parking lot, having a medical procedure, surviving a flood or a tornado, you're talking about this. And often there are other people who have had that same experience with you, right? Their perceptions of it may be different, but they were there at that same event. So you usually don't have that judgment associated with it. Okay, a lot of times, like in domestic violence, there is this underlying judgment associated with the victim, and that just get out of the situation, right? People don't understand the complexities, the risks that they would take, what that could possibly mean to themselves or their children if they left. But here, there's typically no judgment attached to it. They do still have that sense of helplessness though. I mean, it's kind of hard to fight a tornado, right? There's not a whole lot you can do. You try to do everything you can to keep it safe, but it's going to happen whether you do a safe thing or not, all right? So there is still that sense of helplessness. I can't do anything about this massive power that's destroying, the houses all around me. So there are those forces beyond their control, which can lead to that sense of helplessness and maybe a little bit of hopelessness in that there was nothing you could do about it. They also talk about having this irretrievable sense of loss. Again, it can be associated with their loss of a sense of safety. That, here I was thinking I lived in this wonderful, idyllic little house in a community, and this tornado hit and just wiped everything out. It could happen to anybody at any time, and that can impact your sense of safety in the world, right? And then also, they can have the emotional and physical reaction that we talked about, that fight, flight, or freeze. Okay, so that's kind of how we want to categorize some traumatic events, kind of the private or the public. And the reason that we might want to differentiate that is, as you can see, that when you have all of this, it might be a little bit harder to recover than if you experience perhaps a public event. All right, so understanding the context of the event and all that goes along with it is very important in recognizing the impact that it can have on an individual. Any questions so far? Okay. All right, so what we're going to talk about today, and typically when we're talking about becoming a trauma-informed community or trauma interventions, we're typically talking about chronic trauma. Okay? So chronic trauma refers to multiple experiences of some type of traumatic event. It can be the same event occurring over an extended period of time, such as often what happens with physical abuse or sexual abuse. Or it can be a variety of different types of traumatic events that have occurred over a period of time. So an individual perhaps who was physically abused when they were very young, was in a car accident when they were 8 years old, when they were 12 years old, they were in a tornado. When 16, they were sexually assaulted. So you can see that it's just building up, that there's multiple different types of traumatic events they're experiencing. it's important to understand that we cannot take each one of these events in isolation, because each event that impacts our sense of safety brings forward the past events. Okay, that same remembering what it felt like when you were physically abused brings all of that back because it's wired into our brain, and we're going to talk about that. So it's not just each event in and of itself. You have to deal with the cumulative impact. The other thing to think about is that there seems to be this relationship that once you've experienced one traumatic event, you're at higher risk, higher probability. Remember, we're talking probabilities. Higher probability of experiencing a future traumatic event. And part of that, again, goes into how the first traumatic event may impact our brain functioning, how we view the world, which may impact our ability to make sound decisions, which may put us at risk for poor decision making that puts us at risk for future traumas. Okay? Again, it's not a causal thing. It's just kind of that probability that we see. Yes, ma'am? Yeah, it's some folks would say no. Other folks would say yes. My answer would be pretty much yes. The ultimate thing is that this is having a cumulative impact. And when you hear about the brain part and how it impacts the brain, it's because it has that, just the way, how we learn good things is you have to practice, practice, practice. The way that trauma impacts your brain is because if it happens repeatedly or is very intense or happens in early childhood, which makes that complex trauma, it all has an additive effect to it. Does that make sense? So to me, chronic and complex, although you might look at some differences brought in some very specific interventions, the concept of how their brain has been wired still plays that same part. Does that help a little bit? Okay. Other questions at this point? Yes, ma'am.
Do they have a higher probability of experiencing the same event or a higher probability of experiencing any other event?
It can be any other event. Again, because say if a individual has been physically abused as a child, now they're an adolescent, that has impacted their brain development, which means that particularly their higher parts of their brain may have some, I don't want to say missing connections, or so that impacts their ability to make good decisions about safety down the road. So they might find themselves more likely to be drinking at a party, walking the streets at night, increasing their risk that something bad may happen to them. Does that make sense, how that kind of plays into it? Other questions? Okay. So we do know, again, why do I need to understand trauma? Trauma can actually change the structure and the functioning of the brain. All right, there is lots and lots, and it's growing every day, what we know about the impact that trauma has on the brain. We also know that it impacts almost every area of a person's functioning. The relationships, their emotional regulation, their behavioral regulation, their ability to attend and concentrate. We'll talk some about that. Probably a lot of kids out there who have a diagnosis of ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, may be misdiagnosed because actually what they're experiencing is trauma. And that's what we should be treating as opposed to treating the ADHD. But the symptoms can be very much the same because you're going to have that impact on the concentration, the attention, and you may have some hyperactivity, that nervous energy, right? So it also increases the probability of abusing substances as a form of self-medication. It impacts our employment capacities, and it impacts our parenting capacities. And this is one of the things, obviously, in children's division that I really try to get them to emphasize is to help the kids. Obviously, we have to help the families, right? But we keep helping the families as if they're healthy families, and they're not healthy families. Matter of fact, the research shows, and I think I mentioned this later on, you'll find that I get way ahead of myself in the presentation, is that if a child has trauma, the parent likely has an average of 7 traumatic events in their life, which means chronic trauma. And yet we're trying to engage them at this high cognitive, rational level when we need to be engaging them at starting off in the lower parts of the brain, right? So we're trying to send them to therapy and parenting classes and do this and do that and all of this, and they can barely get up in the morning, right? And yet we expect them to do all these other things. So really, this is a huge factor in the children's world, is looking at the impact on parents. So here's just some interesting statistics, because part of being trauma aware is A, understanding the impact of trauma, but also understanding the prevalence of trauma, not only in the general population, but with the population that you serve. Now, we didn't have a chance because of time today to know exactly what organization everybody's in. I learned about a camp in the back, Sherwood Forest Camp, right? All right, which I'm hopefully learn more about. So that knowing that with the foster families that you may be dealing with, families living in poverty, all of those individuals have a high rate of trauma. And so recognizing, like in the mental health field, we should take a universal approach to trauma. That everybody that walks through our door, a community mental health center, a psychiatric hospital, we should assume 100% of that population has trauma. Because in all honesty, it's very close to that. It's about 90%, if not higher. Same thing with the juvenile justice, Department of Corrections, child welfare, all of those high rates of trauma. So to be trauma aware, you have to understand the impact of trauma and understand the prevalence of trauma in your population so that you know how to change your system or respond differently, okay? So rates of PTSD among adults who are formerly placed in foster care, these are old foster kids, is twice that of U.S. war veterans. Yes, you heard that right. PTSD, which was actually developed in response to veterans because of war. If you were in the foster care system as a child, your rate of PTSD is twice as that of war veterans. Now, these kids inherently, right, have theoretically experienced abuse and neglect. They go into a system that right now is trying to deal with trauma, but in the past has not done a really great job of it, just because we didn't know what we were dealing with. And so once you get into the system, what do? We tend to re-traumatize. And it's not just the child welfare system. The mental health system is constantly re-traumatizing individuals and provoking and triggering them during treatment. Seclusion and restraints, very much of a negative response to trauma. Can you imagine a girl who was repeatedly sexually abused as a child going to a psychiatric hospital where she's theoretically going to get some help, and she has men putting hands on her, putting her in mechanical restraints, and giving her sedating medication? Now, I can't judge anybody here because this is what we believe to be the right thing. It's just that we have to start recognizing and making that shift, okay, that this is a highly traumatized population, and actually what we're doing to treat is probably doing more harm than good. Probably true in the physical health field, in many fields. We see it in education. I mean, schools need to really know about trauma because, again, they're going to have a high rate of trauma. And some of the things we do and the way we teach kids, not really the way that kids who have experienced trauma need to be taught. Okay. So that's one of the interesting statistics. 93% of psychiatrically hospitalized adolescents have a history of physical and or sexual abuse or emotional trauma. 1 out of 3 adolescents has been physically or sexually assaulted by the age of 16. That still floors me. I've worked in this field for 25 years, and that just still floors me. And between 59 to 91% of children and youth in the community mental health system have a significant trauma history. And again, the disparity or the difference between here depends on the definition of trauma and how they measured it. Okay, so again, in the mental health field, we need to take a universal approach because it's at about at least 90%. Okay, so that was just some quick introductions about defining trauma, knowing some general impact it has, and then knowing the prevalence. So we're going to get into some of the details that really kind of pulls this all together, the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, and then we're going to talk about the impact on the brain. Okay? How many of you have heard of the Adverse Childhood Experience Study? Okay, we're going to get this to where I ask this question that hands are going to be all over the place. Okay, the Adverse Childhood Experience Study actually done quite a number of years ago, but it didn't start as a study of trauma. It started with Kaiser Permanente, which is a very, very large health insurance company, okay? And they were looking at records around an obesity program that they had started, and they found that some of the folks in the obesity program, right when they began being successful and actually losing weight, dropped out. Now, why would you drop out right when something was being successful, right? So they began doing interviews and focus groups with these individuals, and Dr. Felitti, one of them, of the interviewers or researchers, found this common history of child sexual abuse. So they went back and they did a review of over 17,000 individuals and their medical records. Okay, this is a huge, huge study. They even got Centers for Disease Control to partner with them about this. And these were individuals, you and I. These are individuals who had private insurance. Again, this was not a disenfranchised group of individuals living in severe poverty or urban core areas or anything like this. This is you and I. It represented the gender ratio in the country. It represented the racial makeup in the country. I believe over 50% were college educated, almost all employed, et cetera. Okay, huge study. And what they found, again, was this history of trauma, particularly child abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse. And what the women were saying, basically, is that when they began to lose weight, it started making them feel very, very uncomfortable and anxious. And when you started talking to them a little bit more, it was because they began to eat and use weight as a protective factor against future sexual assaults. So here they thought that they were doing the right thing, you know, getting healthy, losing weight, and yet it was making them feel unsafe, both emotionally and physically. So they dropped out. Okay? So what they have come up with is this adverse childhood experience, because they looked into this Centers for Disease Control, though it was not an experimental study. We didn't hold things in place while we manipulated certain things. The epidemiologist at Centers for Disease Control said you don't find findings like this unless there is a causal relationship, okay? That there is that much of a link between a history of child trauma and long-term health and social negative impact. So, for example, here is the adverse childhood experiences. These were just the ones they studied. This is not a finite list of what's defined as a traumatic event. This is just what they asked in the study. So you have abuse of the child, psychological, physical, sexual. You have trauma in the child's home environment, things like substance abuse, a parental separation or divorce, typically something that's pretty nasty, a member of the family who has a mental illness or is suicidal. We have violence towards the mother, so there may be a domestic violence situation, an incarcerated household member, and then we have issues around neglect of children, abandonment, and not meeting the child's basic physical needs. Okay? That's what they were defining early on in the trauma. What they then found was that people were then had these kind of intermediary behaviors or impacts, such as this neurodevelopment being disrupted. And again, we'll talk about that with the brain impact that it has. Difficulty controlling their anger, hallucinations, depression, panic reactions, anxiety, somatic complaints, that headache, the stomach ache, impaired memories and flashbacks. But they also had these high health risk behaviors, such as smoking, drug usage, severe obesity, physical inactivity, self-injury, alcoholism, eating disorders, sexually transmitted diseases, having 50 or more sexual partners, so some promiscuity, and perpetuating domestic violence. So those are seen as kind of the intervening variables, which then resulted here. Now, I wasn't so surprised, again, when I heard about things like an increased rate of delinquency or criminal behavior or substance abuse or alcoholism. But look at these health outcomes. And this is what they were talking about this morning or earlier today. Heart disease, cancer, chronic lung disease, asthma, liver disease, skeletal fractures, poor self-rated health, and a higher rate of HIV and AIDS. Okay? So you can imagine, though, it's because, and as we talk about the brain development, it literally wears the body out. Okay? So yes, you may be smoking as a mechanism to deal, because smoking releases neurotransmitters that make you feel good. So if you're depressed, having a cigarette may make you feel good. I'm an ex-smoker, so I know it made me feel good when I was smoking. So that can lead to the increase in lung disease, et cetera. We also know, and some of you may remember a couple years ago, that it came out, and I think our own Dr. Parks was one of the national leaders in this, that individuals who had mental illness died approximately 25 years earlier than the general population. Well, the same can be said about trauma, is that they have a much shorter lifespan. Actually, okay, this is Patsy Carter speaking. I think trauma is going to change the way we look at mental illness, for one, and that finding of a shorter lifespan for individuals who have a mental illness is probably the same risk that we're seeing for this trauma, because trauma is going to underlie so many of what we're calling mental illnesses. And I keep saying things like in quotes, what we're calling mental illness, and we'll talk a little bit about that, because we don't really know the direct relationship between trauma and mental illness. We can make some suppositions and which way it goes, and we'll talk some more about that. So that's the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. Now, there has been ongoing research since this original study, but it basically shows that these trauma experiences are more common than we thought. It reveals a powerful relationship between our emotional experiences in childhood and our physical and our mental health as an adult. And it talks about how that conversion actually happens. And it's part of that impact on the brain that we're going to talk about next. But to give you some other concepts, okay, so down here, these are very primitive graphs. Down here is what we call their ACE score. That's the number of traumatic events that they have experienced, okay? So they've had no traumatic events, 1, 2, 3, or more than 4. This is a percentage, and in this case, it's what percentage have a history of depression. So you can see if you have no traumatic event, that your risk of depression is down somewhere between 10, maybe 8 to 18%. But as the number of traumatic events occurs, or the population that has an increased rate, so does the likelihood of depression. Okay? We see this pattern time and time and time again. Now, before anybody asks, men and women, different. We don't really know what the cause is here. Some of it could be, people say that women tend to be more emotional, right? And so more internalizing, so it just naturally a higher risk for depression. The other possibility is that men tend to not want to admit that they're feeling depressed, and so this may be underreporting on men's part that shows the difference. We don't really know. But what we really are looking at is this trend, okay? And again, you see it time and time again in a number of different things. Here with some social problems, here's being a victim of domestic violence. Again, you see that trend. Here's women, here's men. Similarly, for perpetrating domestic violence. You know, we'd like to think that if you've been a victim of domestic violence that you might not perpetrate, but we know that there's a smaller group that actually ends up becoming perpetrators themselves. Here's another example. This is about the impaired worker performance. And the reason I don't want to make this just about mental illness and the incidence of depression or anything like that is because we do have to recognize it's not just those other people, it's us. and particularly for those of us working in the field, where we're going to be dealing with vicarious or secondary trauma, which basically is because of the work that we do and because we have such limited resources that we are at high risk for experiencing vicarious trauma. So, absenteeism for employees, same pattern. Serious financial problems, same pattern. Serious job problems, same pattern. So this can be you and I. Any questions on that, on the A study? It's just a quick, yes, sir?
Not exactly on that, but I have two children.
Uh-huh.
And one of them is going to be traumatized by almost nothing, and the other one is going to be traumatized by any little thing. So is it based on their perception, not necessarily the event?
Correct, but it's not just their perception. It's their coping mechanisms, which are both internal and external. So again, this is a little bit more advanced, but everybody is born, and although learning and experience has a great deal to do, we do have our own personal temperaments that we're born with. So those are our internal resources. And then there are external resources, such as your family support, your friends, how you being involved in different activities. I will pick on myself. I am an introvert, which puts me at higher risk because I don't have as broad of a social network, and I tend to kind of, when I need to de-stress, I turn inward. Okay, I need to be by myself. But the research says that puts me at higher risk for the impact of trauma. So we always think, kids, they live in the same environment, they should have the same thing. But actually, as soon as another child is born, that whole environment changes, right? So we never actually have the exact same environment. So it's going to be a combination of their internal and their external capacities for coping and support that may make the difference in how they manage the same event. Does that make sense? I know, for example, when it comes to a personal crisis for me, I'm not really that good. You need to go to somebody else in my family for a personal crisis. Somebody else's crisis I'm okay with, but for its personal. But that, I'm probably one of the more introverted in my family. And we have birth orders and all different types of who's got what kind of coping mechanisms, et cetera. Does that help a little bit? Okay. Other questions or thoughts? Okay. Now, I'm going to mention a friend of mine's name because many of you, particularly from MIMH and DMH, know her. Robin Bosted was really my mentor in trauma, and she was the one who got me to start this trauma initiative for the Department of Mental Health with Dr. Park's support. She always loved the A study. That's what she wanted to talk about all the time. To me, it's this brain stuff that I just find absolutely fascinating and makes all the difference. And it really makes you understand what we're dealing with. So let me say early on so that nobody gets too worried, you don't have to remember all the names of things. There are words that are going to be up on the screen that I still can't pronounce. But what I want you to understand is that there is a neurological and biological basis for the behaviors that we're seeing out of kids, adults, trauma survivors. Okay? That it's not just get over it. It's not we put you in a safe environment, so now you shouldn't have any problems. That it's because of the impact the trauma has had on the wiring in their brain. And until you grasp that, you're going to be using inappropriate interventions and seeing things in a very different lens than the lens of trauma. Okay? So, at birth, we are born with about the same number of neurons that we have as an adult. Brain cells, neurons, the brain cells. Okay? It's about 25% the size and weight of the adult brain, but we have about the same number of neurons. What changes is the connections between those brain cells. That's what brain growth is. And the first 2 years of life, that growth is astronomical. It's just bigger, faster than you could ever see, and actually continues on until the first 5 years of life. That's why we talk about it's good to have, things that can stimulate a baby's brain. We want to give them lots of different experiences because that's what makes those connections. If you have to do things at the same time, for example, to learn to, hold a glass of milk or a bottle of milk, you have to have your eyes and your hands working together, right? Recognizing what the bottle looks like, knowing where to put your hand, how you move it up to your mouth, doing the sucking, all of that goes into drinking a bottle. They don't automatically are born doing that. They have to start learning. When they make those connections between that eye-hand movement, those neurons get wired. Okay, so we say neurons that fire together, wire together. And that's brain growth. That's what happens. So, it's nearly the same number of neurons. It's the connections that grow. As I mentioned already, at birth, our brainstem is pretty fully developed. That's what takes care of our automatic or autonomic responses. Digesting food, breathing, heart rate, all of those things. Okay? So while I'm up here talking, I don't have to think about digesting that Panera sandwich that I had for lunch, right? Because that could be really distracting if I had to think about that right now. But I can just hope my body does it. Same thing with our heart rate, same thing with our breathing, and a lot of other of our physiological responses. Okay? Our brain starts developing, and now we know that the frontal cortex, which is the last part of the brain to develop, in women, typically, it's not fully developed until about mid-20s. For men, sorry, it's late 20s, maybe 30. It doesn't mean you're not functional. It just means that we still have some growing to do, okay? And I say this to people all the time. If you've sent a child of 18 out on their own, either to college or a job or something like that, how many of you said, yes, I know they are so mature and they will not have any problems when they go away, right? No, right. You're just waiting for those midnight phone calls and those crises that are going to happen because they don't have that fully developed brain yet, right? That cortex, which is the CEO, it's the rational, cognitive part of our brain, all right? Not fully developed, mid to late 20s. So what we have is the brain developing from the back forward. The number of neurons are basically in place, like I said. It's the number of synaptic connections that increases until early adolescence. And then the opposite happens. Okay? And this is a natural process. This isn't part of the trauma process. This is the natural process of pruning. It makes our brain more efficient. Those connections that are not needed because we didn't use them very often are pruned and go away. Those that we have used repeatedly and have served some function for us in our life are strong. All right? So by pruning, it's the same thing as keeping a tree healthy. You get rid of some of the limbs to keep the whole tree healthy. So by pruning some of these unneeded, based on their experiences, connections, it makes the other part stronger. So if you've got an individual who's growing up in a sub-Saharan village somewhere where there's a lot of hunting, gathering going on, what develops in their brain is going to be different than what develops in somebody who's living in this urban area where it's very fast-paced. I mean, the most you're doing is going to the store to buy a hamburger, right? You're not out there having to hunt and gather for your own food. It requires different skills. That's the adaptability of our brain, as it responds to the environment and what we need to survive in that environment. All right, so that's in a typical environment. What if that environment has chronic stress or chronic trauma? How they respond to that chronic trauma and that stress is what gets strong in their brain, because that's helping their survival. Does that make sense? These are their coping mechanisms. Now, it's a coping mechanism that worked in this so-called traumatic environment. If you take them out of that traumatic environment and place them in what you perceive as a safe environment, we all believe all that stuff should go away, right? Because now they're in a safe environment. Their brain is not wired for that. So what we see as these maladaptive, negative symptoms or behaviors are actually their coping mechanisms, the way their brain was wired through that chronic trauma. Does that make sense? Okay. So here's an example of those synaptic connections. At birth, these larger black dots are the actual nerve cells, right? Long connections, those are axons. Again, you don't have to know all the language to do with this. I'm just explaining it to you so that, I'm not just making it up. Of course, I guess I could be making it up too, but I'm not. Believe you me, I'm not making it up. So this is how we communicate. One neuron, its axons reach out to the next neuron's dendrite, which brings it back into the nerve cell. That's how we communicate. Okay, it's a combination of electrical impulses and chemical releases. You'll hear us talk a lot about neurotransmitters, right? We have serotonin, we have dopamine, we have norepinephrine, are the three that are typically involved in a trauma response, okay? A lot of those have to do with our reward systems, making us feel better, okay, and kind of our behavioral or our physiological regulation. So here at 6 years old, you can see this network has gotten very dense with the connections. Because, again, we want a child to learn as much as they can, and we give them lots of different experiences. Okay? We give them balls to play with, puzzles to do. We're talking to them, giving them language. Use your words. We're reading to them. All of those things are making those connections. We're also making connections when they're sexually abused, when they're physically abused, when they know that when dad comes home and he's been drinking, the likelihood that they're going to get hurt goes up. That gets wired in their brain. All right? They may start doing things to help them deal with the traumatic event that they're having. Okay? Now, to take it the next step, then you see that this is not quite so dense at the age of 14, because some of those synaptic connections that didn't really get used a whole lot are pruned. So if you're a 14-year-old who their reading and language was not a big thing in your family, you probably don't have strong connections for language. But if you're a child that grew up and mom was always talking to you and reading to you, that you have this verbal ability, it's because you have lots of connections that are made and they're strong, so they're staying in place and not getting pruned. All right? Think about learning to play baseball, learning to play tennis, learning to play the piano. It's all about practice, practice, practice. I wanted to learn to play the flute when I was in school, but I didn't want to practice, right? My mom said, you don't practice, you're not getting the flute. So I love my mother. I may talk about her, but I love my mother. We have to recognize that what we start off learning, say learning how to play the piano, we may start off feeling very uncomfortable. Where do I put my hands? How do I sit? What are the black keys? I have to look at my hands to figure this all out. But with practice, 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 it becomes almost automatic, right? You don't have to look at your hands anymore. You don't have to worry about where you're putting them or how it just comes automatically to you. All right. Again, that's because of the wiring in the connections. But if those connections are learning to dissociate when you are in too much physical pain, that's what gets strong. So we see a lot of kids who engage in behaviors because that's what kept them safe or helped them survive. I shouldn't say kept them safe. It helped them survive these negative experiences as a child. Now they're in a different environment, and we're saying that those are problems for them, and yet it's what helped them survive. So we have to, again, rethink these behaviors as coping mechanisms. They may not be working for the kid now because they're not in that same environment, but they're coping mechanisms. And usually when you see a child or an adult acting out, what you have to figure out is what made them feel unsafe. It may not be anything that's obvious to us. For example, do you mind if I touch you on the shoulder? real lightly. Is that okay? Okay. And your name is? Tamika. Okay, so Tamika, I'm going to say you're a third grader in school, right? And supposed to be working on a class assignment. And Tamika, the teacher looks over. She's not working on the assignment, seems to be daydreaming, not paying attention. So the teacher comes over and says, come on, Tamika, get to work, and lays a hand on Tamika's shoulder. Tamika jumps up, curses at the teacher, kicks her in the shin, and gets in a very defensive stance. Now, what's that teacher thinking? Whoa, Tamika's dangerous. She can't be in the same classroom with these other kids. She's unpredictable. Nothing was going on in the classroom. I just told her to get her work done. And she, assaulted me. Now we're going to send her off to the principal, right? She's probably going to get suspended for physical aggression against a teacher. Very typical. All right, so let's shift this scenario. Tamika comes from a home where there is physical abuse. She, matter of fact, was just physically abused that morning. She wasn't actually daydreaming, but dissociating because she wasn't feeling safe. That physical touch on her shoulder, as light as it was, and even if the teacher was saying things in a very calm voice, disassociation, she's not in the here and now. She's back in that abusive situation. That touch was a trigger. She's responding to that as if that's danger. Okay? That was her coping mechanism. Yet we see it. Now we're sending her to the principal's office, who's going to suspend her. Again, typical response, understand where it's coming from. But she's going to go home, probably what? May get in trouble again, right, abused again. So it's just an example of we have to look, and I keep saying look at things through the lens of trauma, because we have to understand Tamika probably wasn't feeling safe, was dissociating, needed to bring her back to the here and now. We talk about that a lot, about grounding techniques and bringing people back to the here and now so that we know that they're not thinking they're back in that trauma situation. Okay? And again, there's a whole physiological basis for these memories and how we respond to them. It's a little bit more advanced than what we can get into today, but there is that physiological basis to all of this. Okay, thanks, Tamika. Any questions on that? Is that making sense? You understanding the physical connection to all of this? Okay. So basically we know more stimulation, the better for neural development, if it's positive stimulation, right? I mean, if we're going to have more neural development, even if it's negative, it's just not going to be the right kind of neural development that we want. So when the stimulation comes from that chronic trauma, it strengthens the brain's connections to that trauma emotional response. Early childhood trauma is associated, if you have severe chronic early childhood trauma, the brain can even be smaller because of it. Okay? So it changes the structure and the functioning of the brain. Again, we can't just expect these people to just get over it, even if they're not in the same abusive type situation. And we have to remember it's the cortex that regulates our memory, our attention, our perceptual understanding and awareness, thinking, language, our consciousness. All of that goes and is controlled by different parts of the brain. One of the advancements that Dr. Perry is making right now is to do a functional mapping of the brain, figuring out where an individual is in their brain development, not by their chronological age, but what they're actually capable of doing. All right? And so if they're 10 years old, but their brain is still hardly developed past the brainstem, and we're trying to teach them and talk to them like a 10-year-old, it's not going anywhere, right? They just don't have the brain capacity for that to happen. We have to figure out where they are in their brain development and match our interventions to where they are in their brain development. The further back in the brain you go, the more primitive, the less cognitive our interventions need to be. There you're talking about a lot of sensory and rhythmic type of interventions, and we'll talk about a little bit about that today, and then again in some of the more advanced training. Any questions? Starting to understand the brain side of this, just generally? Okay. So when we have strong and prolonged activation of the body's stress response, and in particular, if we do not have what we call the buffering protection of adult support, then that's going to impact the development of the brain. And it's why we spend so much time emphasizing children having strong adult connections, having that one positive, because actually that is physiologically what can help mitigate the impact of the trauma. We teach resiliency in kids, whether we know it or not. Hopefully, rocking is a very soothing and helps self-regulation. Listening to the mother's heartbeat, again, is very helpful in self-regulating. So when you have an infant who's upset, we rock and we hold them close up to the chest. That starts teaching self-regulation. In Bruce Perry's work, again, in more advanced sessions, we can talk about how we use some of those same type of rhythmic connections to help regulate kids, okay? We want to get them, kids who have serious trauma histories often have a resting heart rate much higher than non-victims, okay? And what we want to do is try to get that, the typical is about 80 beats per minute, and we want to get that, try to get them regulated there as opposed to the 100 that they're typically at. So there's lots of things that we can do to try to improve their ability to manage their stress. What we also know is that they will then react at a much, their frustration level or point is much lower, and so they're more likely to be triggered easily, okay? So, again, here are some of the words that I can't pronounce, you don't have to remember, but just understanding that there is stress response pathways in our body. Again, this is part of our evolution to keep us healthy and alive as a species, all right? And so we have all these different hormones, adrenaline, we'll talk some about neurotransmitters, this is the word I can't pronounce, glucocorticoids, I can't say it, along with our adrenaline, which most people have heard about, help us in the formation of memories, particularly if it's a sudden emotional memory. We call those flashbulb memories. It can be good or negative, but it's sudden. That's what we think is behind some of these flashback phenomenons with individuals who have trauma histories, is because they have these very vivid flashbulb memories, and these come back as flashbacks. Okay, so again, a physiological basis for what they're experiencing. So over time, the acute stress response takes a toll on our body. It creates different pathways in our neural connections and in how some of these neurotransmitters are released in our body. Again, typically the dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine. Here's an example, and I hope the folks who are listening, I guess, can see this slide as well. What we have is, again, normally you and I may have some stress. So, you know, our heart rate goes up, our palms start sweating, our stomach, we get butterflies, we get headaches, whatever it is, however we respond to stress. It'll go up, it'll come down. We go along, then we have some more stress in our life, it goes up, it comes down, and you kind of have that pattern, okay? But because it's not severe, it's not chronic, it's not complex, we're recovering. When you have that chronic or that complex trauma, you go along and yes, your body, you'll go under stress, you'll go up, you'll go down, you'll go up, you'll go down, and you'll follow that pattern until you go up and one of two things happens. You don't come all the way down. That's where we're talking about that heart rate, that resting heart rate, like at 100, okay? Think of yourself pumped up on caffeine. I know, if I get more than 2 cups of caffeine, I'm just wild and out there. This is how they are functioning on a day-to-day basis. Now, when you are as stressed like that, and you know that you're going to get some relief because you don't have the chronic trauma, right? But when you're at that top peak point, are you making your best decisions? Are you friendly and energetic and nice and thinking clearly? No. You're probably irritable. You're not thinking very well because, again, your body is in survival mode. When your body goes in survival mode, it's just like you were being chased by that bear. It goes to the lower parts of the brain. It's where it sends its body, or the blood in the body, to do its most good. We want to have that body ready for running, right? If we have to run flee from the bear or if we had to fight that bear. All of those things happen even from these emotional traumas. It's the same thing as if we were being chased by a bear. Okay? So you get that stuck on high. You get what looks like hyperactivity, hypervigilance, mania, some rage, anxiety, panic attacks. Okay? And again, don't those all sound like symptoms of a mental illness? And in particular, I often think of bipolar with this one, right? That up and down, right. Okay, the other thing that can happen is you go up, you go down, you go up, you go down, you go up, and you go too far down. And now you're sluggish, you're lethargic, you're depressed, you're fatigued, you hardly have the energy to get up, let alone to go to a parent-teacher conference, bringing along your 3 toddlers, and you just worked all day. You just barely can survive. And yet we want you to do this, 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 and this. Their brain can't handle it. They're stuck on a hypoarousal. You have depression, the disconnection, the fatigue, and that numbness. Because again, being numb is a survival technique if you're being hurt. If your body can't handle the emotional, the psychic, the physical pain, your body shuts down. It's a coping mechanism. That's what we're seeing. And yet we label it as symptoms and maladaptive and something to be changed, right? To them, to survivors, it's a automatic survival technique. Make sense? Okay, good. Okay, so the meaning of a traumatic event in the life of a child may be based on their stage of cognitive and emotional development. And again, when you ask the question about having 2 siblings, if one is 2 years old and the other 7, where they are in their cognitive development, so how they process that traumatic event may be very different, okay? So, relationships are developed through that emotional bond between the primary caregiver, and it is through this relationship that we learn to do all of these things. Again, we talk about that rocking, that soothing, the eye contact. All of those things help us soothe and relax. I don't know if any of you have seen the YouTube video where you've got a mother and an infant. The mother is right in front of the infant. They're making eye contact. They're interacting. It's nothing special about their interaction, but they're making eye contact. The mother moves her face and her eye contact about 20, 30 degrees so she's not staring at the child. The child starts becoming emotionally dysregulated, starts crying. I mean, you can see it build up in the child. They're starting to get more fidgety and crying. And then when the mother puts her eye contact back, the baby soothes. Just eye contact. It's not the mother's pinching her or anything like that, just moving the eye contact. So all of these things that we think about and we may take advantage or for granted in our relationships with our parents or our caregivers are very important to developing our ability to self-soothe and self-regulate. If you don't have that in your early relationships, you're not going to develop that capacity. Okay? Because again, those connections are not being made in your brain cells. And we're going to have to go through some quick talking here to get through everything. Early childhood is a very vulnerable time for experiencing trauma because of the critical time of brain development. This is when those connections are being made. All right? So traumatic events have a profound sensory impact on young children. Sight, sound, taste, all of those things. It's much more sensory-driven than cognitive-driven in early childhood. All right? And that's why you may have triggers that are very sensory-related. It may be the smell of something. It may be the color red. All of those things, the sound of something. It may be a bell ringing, a doorbell ringing, a phone ringing, whatever that. Those may be associations with those early traumatic events because young children are much more sensory-driven than cognitively driven. Young children also don't necessarily understand cause and effect, right? So they don't know, is this my fault? What made this happen? They may blame their parent inappropriately, or they may think that it's because they're bad that they're being physically or sexually abused. They don't get that cause and effect. They may blame their parents for not preventing, frightening events and keeping them safe, like it's your fault that the tornado came, Mom, because you didn't keep me safe. If a parent and a child are sharing a traumatic event, you have to recognize, again, that impact on the parent and their ability to be able to soothe the child or not be able to soothe the child because of their own traumatic experience. And then young children, obviously, they really don't have much control. They can't get up and leave the house and say, I'm going to go move in with Aunt Joan or something like that. They're stuck in the environment. They don't have that level of control, so they're much more vulnerable. Again, we talked about their vulnerability due to their brain development. They're less able to anticipate danger and to seek safety responses. And the other is that they cannot often express themselves verbally, and so they may not be able to talk about their past trauma history or put it into some meaningful conceptualization of what went on, whereas if it happens to an adult, we have that cognitive capacity. Okay? So trauma that occurs in early childhood has a profound different type of impact and can have a very strong or a stronger impact than if it happens later in life. All right? Here are some of the impact of trauma on young children. Again, this can happen across the lifespan, but if they haven't developed their verbal skills, then they can't use that schema in their brain to understand the trauma or to deal with the trauma later on. So we may see memory problems, temper problems. We may see regression in their development, or they just may not achieve at a typical rate of development. There is some evidence growing as well that a lot of these kids may look like they have some pervasive developmental or autistic symptoms, and sometimes may also be misdiagnosed because they don't have that social capacity that a child not growing up with trauma may have. Behavior, they're at higher risk for substance abuse, both for that self-medication impact and escape, so that they are much higher risk for substance abuse. We may see more of that repetitive thinking about hurting themselves or hurting others. We may see a lot of anger towards their perpetrator and almost plans of retaliation against their perpetrator. Again, you may see a lot of problems with authority because remember that authority, that disparate power imbalance, they've got to bring that forward to every later relationship they have with authority figures. So you may be the nicest teacher in the world, you may be a great minister, a really good police officer, but how they're going to see you is through that authority lens, okay? Which means that they may not be very trusting and safe. We already talked about the caregivers. Here's the impact that we can see on caregivers. You probably, again, have seen this time and time again. The one thing I'm just going to say about diagnosis is that it's not always post-traumatic stress disorder. You can have an individual who does not have post-traumatic stress disorder but is significantly impacted by trauma. Obviously, if you have PTSD, you have a traumatic history. We're not real clear yet on the relationship between mental illness and trauma. Does trauma cause mental illness? We do know that people with a pre-occurring mental illness may be more vulnerable to the impact of trauma. Trauma survivors do not like to be labeled with a diagnosis and may be resistant to it because, as you will learn as we go into the field of becoming trauma responsive and trauma informed, we want you to change your question. It's not what's wrong, it's what happened to them. And if you can make that shift today in thinking about what that means, you're on your way, that first step towards becoming trauma-informed. It's not what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you. And time again, I was at a residential program just doing this training. We were doing it over 2 days, or the trauma-responsive training. There was an incident on one of the units. One of the participants went back, and rather than going into that, what's wrong with you? Why are you going off? Why are you mad? Why are you hitting somebody? They came in calmly and just said, what happened? What happened to you? They said that the child was just stunned. They weren't prepared for that, and they were able to immediately kind of calm him down and de-escalate him because it was a totally different approach because they're used to being viewed as bad, wrong, aggressive, and instead of thinking about what happened to them. Here are some evidence-based practices, but as I noted, the field is changing here in the evidence-based practices. These have been proven to be effective but with certain populations, and they have to have a certain cognitive capacity. What we're finding now is for the younger kids and for severe trauma, when they're not able to benefit from cognitive interactions, we're having to use more sensory type interactions. Drumming, rhythmic things, music, art, all of those, if done in a specific trauma-informed way, it means you know what you're talking about with trauma, can be very helpful in preparing the brain for future cognitive work. Here's that changing the question. I am aggressive, I am depressed, I'm an alcoholic, as opposed to what happened to you when I'm a survivor of trauma. We know that we may, as I've talked about, unintentionally trigger folks through our systems. That's why we feel like it's very important for people to become trauma responsive and trauma informed. The one thing I want to say about becoming trauma informed, these are the core principles of becoming trauma informed. Trauma informed is a culture shift, right? It's a way of looking at your organization's policies, your practices, your environments. It's not a one-time thing. It's not a program. It's not an intervention. It is your organization, okay? It's something that you will work on probably for the remainder of your organization's tenure, in that you will always be looking every new policy through that lens of trauma. And in the trauma responsive training, we'll talk more about how you move towards becoming a trauma-informed organization. Like I mentioned, Kansas City has a whole group. They've been working on becoming a trauma-informed community for a while. It's not just mental health organizations. It's not just doctors' offices. It's schools. It's library. When the first trauma-informed community, the two leaders of their trauma-informed initiative was the town's yoga instructor and the librarian. It's different. It's not what you think it is. I hope you'll learn more, because it's more than just offering a evidence-based intervention for trauma. Okay? Matter of fact, if you ask trauma survivors, would they rather go and be in an organization that's trauma-informed or that has specific interventions for trauma? They would much rather be part of a trauma-informed organization than having the interventions. Okay? So a lot of folks are out there saying, you know, we provide trauma-informed care because they offer an intervention for trauma. That doesn't make you trauma-informed. You may be triggering and re-traumatizing folks that are coming to your organization. So hopefully you'll come back and learn much, much more about that. There's some resources listed. Actually, I'm going to give you one other thing that we just started in Missouri. It's a website called ACEs Connection. ACEs as an Adverse Childhood Experience Connection. It is kind of a way to stay connected with the community. We now have a Missouri group. There's not a whole lot out there yet because I haven't had a time to put a bunch of stuff out there, but it's growing. You can have chats with other folks. You'll learn from other folks what's going on in Missouri. So that's a great way to kind of get started, and we just intentionally created this so that we would have that possibility.